Good evening. My name is Christian Jewell and I'm the manager of the Asia Pacific Design Library here at State Library. I'd like to welcome you to what's now the 7th lecture in the UQ Architecture Lecture Series. It's been a fantastic series so far and we want to thank you all for your support. Before we start, I need to remind you that if you have your mobile phone with you, can you please put it on silent? Or switch it off, but we would like you to join the conversation online as well by using the Twitter hashtag APDL lecture. There will hopefully be time for questions at the end of tonight's lecture, so if you do want to ask a question, you can put your hand up or you can ask a question on Twitter and we'll ask it for you. And I'll also encourage you, hopefully we'll have time following this lecture, but tonight's event is presented around the Capathetical competition, and Brit, Anderson's and Mara's Francis's entry from that competition is on display in the Design Lounge, which is just adjacent to the auditorium here. That'll be on display for the remainder of the week, so that will give you some context if you haven't already seen that work to tonight's lecture, so I encourage you to visit that at some point following the lecture. I'd now like to welcome Professor Michael Kendiger to introduce tonight's event.
Thank you. Well, welcome to you all, and we deeply appreciate just how many people are passionate about cities and about your national capital and the ideas it might provoke are here this evening. We're drawn here because this is the centenary of Canberra that's being celebrated throughout the year, and I think we can thank three people for driving us into the room. One is Robin Archer, who's the director of the celebration activities in Canberra, and she put her weight and passion to driving forward the competition called Capathetical, which was meant to refocus on issues of nationhood and issues of place and issues of substance. And I'll come back to that or we'll come back to that jointly. We also should thank, and I think we should also congratulate Brit Andresen and Mara Francis on winning the second prize in that competition, and with their competition entry, Sedimentary City, which they will talk about in more detail as we go through. But I think it's a signal contribution that they've made to ideas. Often we talk about urbanism. We're actually talking about place and city making, which I think have proved to be so tangible. So thank you to Brit and Mara. We're sitting here. I'm told that this is meant to be kind of relaxed and informal. I've never felt so uncomfortable and so informal. We're dressed completely in black, grey and white, and how we managed to do that is a condemnation of the influence of Melbourne on Brisbane, and we should have had a splash of colour somewhere next time. The way we've chosen to work is we'll work as a series of kind of parallel presentations around the issues to do with the competition, either its shaping or its outcomes or what it might provoke, and the entry that Brit and Mara put together and the ideas that they have brought forward. We'll jump the gap between us as we move through with a short question just to make sure that we're still awake at the front here. A point of awkwardness for us is the images are up there and we're looking at a tiny screen down here, so inevitably we'll be craning around and not looking at you from time to time. So please excuse that. We'll be keeping to time as far as I can persuade my colleagues to remain on time, but we will get there. And on that note, I'd like to introduce, I think you know us all, but the introductions are informal. I'd like to introduce Anthony Moulis. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, look, my role is to talk about celebrating Canberra 100 years, and so... Okay, over here. Very good. Thanks, Christian. Thanks for that tip. Okay, I'm going to be speaking about Canberra and the 100-year celebrations, but in an interested way rather than a disinterested way, because I reveal to you now that I grew up in the city from the late 60s to the mid-1980s. So there, I've said it. And so the city leaves its imprint. We'll see what that's about. But I'm talking a bit about the architectural exhibitions and celebrations that have accompanied this 100 years. So I'm going to talk about 5 events of an architectural nature that have been on here. Now, these are 2 of them, the 2 of the main ones. The one at the top you can see described there is called the Design 29, Creating a Capital. So this is a display at the National Archive of the original drawings of the Canberra competition. So it's a great opportunity to see these drawings, these original drawings. So it's great in that sense. Of course, it shows Walter Burley and Marion Mahoney Griffin's drawings, which are a sight to behold. I'll say a little more about that. The work of Eliel Saarinen, the Finnish architect, whose work was second placed. Donat Alfred Agache, a French architect and urbanist who became better known later because he was the 1930 master planner of the city of Rio. And then there was a 4th place scheme by an Australian team of Griffiths, Coulter and Caswell that was also on display. Well, I guess I went and viewed this exhibition, and I really wanted to see the Griffin drawings in the first instance because they're very beautiful, of course. Marion's famed elevations are very beautiful. And there is something about their well-observed nature that I think is pertinent. And in these images, a comparison of Marion's drawing and a more recent photo of the same view, looking onto Camp Hill, where the new Parliament House is, or so-called new Parliament. The thing that struck me was really the line of Red Hill, which from Marion's drawing to the present image is exactly the same. I mean, which I think is quite extraordinary. I mean, she really attended to and observed very carefully the land. And even though the final result of the city we now see does not, only approximates the vision that they had for what would go here, it's right, the idea remains. So it struck me that the Griffins showed how to build a capital in this setting. They showed how to do that, in a sense. So the architectural suggestions were just that. Their scheme provided an enabling framework for this city to evolve. In contrast, other schemes presented were more just an image of a city. And you'd be hard-pressed to think how anyone else could contribute to this image apart from Saarinen himself in building such a monumental place. So that was of interest to me. The second exhibition, Dream of a Century, the Griffins... I'll just go back to that former slide. The Dream of the Century, the Griffins in Australia's national capital, was at the National Library, and that was really quite an interesting one. It drew on a collection of work, a vast collection which was acquired by the National Library from one of the Australian partners of the Griffins, from his family, Eric Milton Nichols, and it drew some attention to some interesting facts. That Griffin himself, it was his dream to design the Australian capital upon hearing of federation in 1901. And he followed the story of Australia through the press. So that was kind of interesting. And another interesting fact that was raised there was that Marion developed a planting scheme for Mount Ainslie and Black Mountain. So when she came, she observed the eucalypts and she looked for a book about them. She didn't find one, so she made her own inventory. And she started to do some planting on those 2 mountains with different hues of eucalypt, in terms of the flowers. So I thought that was kind of an interesting fact. Then we come to the capathetical competition itself, which was exhibited in the Gallery of Australian Design on the southern shore of the lake. I guess my own response to the display was how it reflected on the present city, the city I grew up in, and I think perhaps unsurprisingly the present city stood up pretty well. And of course Brit and Mara's proposal, which is featured here, was intriguing, I thought, for presenting the city in time, sort of across time, with these layers being imagined a bit like a reverse archaeology or a future and past ruins, but I'll leave them to explain how that works. The other one that was going on was this parallel competition for a lodge on the lake design competition run out of the University of Canberra as a hypothetical competition for a residence for the Prime Minister on the lake shore. And as being a resident, I reflected that the only person who lived on the lake shore when I was there was the Governor-General. That was the only house in the whole place which fronted the lake. Everything else was pulled back from the lake. And within the last 10 years or so, a development has been built called along Kingston foreshore on the eastern basin of the lake, where buildings come right up to the edge. And it turns the lake into a bit of a puddle, I'm afraid, because in terms of the scale of those buildings, it sort of destroys that sense of the expansive landscape, I think. But it's probably a nice place to live in. The thing that I was invited to participate in was this little exhibition called Imprint, Growing Up Planned, on the basis that it was contacting artists, architects who'd grown up in the city and had left the city, and for them to reflect back on what it was like to be there. And this was curated by Virginia Rigney from the Gold Coast Art Gallery. So this was rather an intriguing problem, and I came up with a set of 3 houses. So I reimagined 3 monuments in Canberra, and I sought to reoccupy them in an imaginative way. I tried to take buildings that people sort of took for granted in the landscape and reanimate them. So I thought about the fact that the National Library in Canberra was based on the Parthenon. It's got 1 less column along its length than the actual Parthenon. Maybe they thought there'd be some problem with copyright or something, but they did 1 less. But nonetheless, I just thought it was a great place to put a statue. I thought it was a great place to put a statue of Athena. So I made this collage to begin with, placing Athena, who was obviously in the Parthenon, inside the National Library, and made some drawings to illustrate this proposal, taking out the centre of the building, leaving everything else in place, like the desks and stuff, so people could still do their study, but have Athena there. So this was one way that I tried to draw attention to the fact that of these monuments, and we take them for granted, but they belong to a long tradition in a way in terms of their making in Canberra. I'll just flick back to this image, which is by Bruce Reynolds. He's an artist practicing in Brisbane, and he does things on lino. I'm revealing to you now that Bruce Reynolds grew up in Canberra too. And upon this lino, kitchen lino, which he assembles together, he put these images of Canberra, and I like this one because he went up in a hot air balloon on a nice Canberra morning and took these aerial shots of the city and then had them printed over the lino. So I thought that was rather nice. With my own project, there's another couple of houses here, and I'd like to thank Chris Skinner, who's in the audience, for helping me with that work. So that's all I'm going to say. And so I'm going to hand back to Mick.
And Mick is going to ask a question.
Yeah, you're going to ask me a question.
Because it's so informal. And the great advantage I have is I've known Anthony for goodness knows how many years. I know he spent more than half his life possibly in Brisbane. And so he may pretend to come from Canberra. And so that kind of calls into question what is imprinted when you come from a place. And I'm really fascinated by the approach you took, which is to take national monuments or buildings that have some pretension to be monuments, and you vary them by referring back to something that's even more deeply imprinted, which is your own culture, your knowledge of Greece and all that. Mm. So, coming to Brisbane, what monument here would you select to adjust, vary, enrich?
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's one. There you go.
No, look, I guess what intrigued me when I was exhibiting this work, something that came up in that moment was the fact that someone was looking at the work and I overheard them say, "Oh, I didn't know Athena was in the National Library." People appropriate these monuments very unconsciously in a way. They don't know what these things are about. I mean, another one I looked at was the Carillon, and nobody knows that the Carillon was for the celebration of 50 years of Canberra. It was a gift in that respect. So, it's just sitting there. So I guess in Brisbane, one of the monuments that sort of comes to mind is the one of European settlement, the one supposedly celebrating Oxley's Landing, which is now caught up in the freeway, which thousands of people drive past on a yearly basis, but no one would really know what it was for. There's a stone sitting there somewhere near North Quay. And so I guess it would be that monument.
Yeah, and?
And somewhere else?
No, that will do.
Thank you.
But I look forward to seeing the scheme, Anthony. That'd be good. So just moving on, as many of you would know, I've had a fair amount to do with the shaping of competitions on their conditions or sitting on jury panels. And so I've been asked to just comment on the competition itself and to ponder why. I mean, why is competition itself in this day and age useful? I mean, what was Robin Archer seeking? And I think what she was intending was to reflect back on, or to bring forward, perhaps a better way of putting it, a better understanding of what were the pressures of the day as a new nation was formed and in its forming began to seek a symbol of its new nationhood through the creation of a capital. And in doing so, to go through all the catharsis involved in selecting a site and defining a brief and shaping the conditions and so on. And the capathetical competition in its timing and in the dates used reflects almost directly the period of time set for the initial competition way back in 1911, thereabouts. And the thing that we kind of like, we talk about here, we talk about our city a lot, and we also talk about cities in general a lot. But we don't have the responsibility of making a new city in a place that we have to choose. And I think one of the things that reading back through the history of that competition was just how much effort went into selecting the place and defining the initial criteria and to generating the material that the architects would use to pull their schemes together. What was interesting, it was without any embarrassment, an international competition. The assumption was that the ideas would come from somewhere else. And Australia kind of falters these days by thinking, well, should we be international or not? What is international? Surely we're good enough to be international and so on. But at the time, there had been a regeneration or a focus on issues to do with town planning. The RIBA in 1910 in London brought together the first major conference on town planning. The resulting papers that came out of that were published. There were 812 pages, which I haven't read, but I'll leave that to you. But what it did was to create a ferment around ideas to do with the making of cities. And very much the competition for Canberra hoped to capitalise on some of that thinking. Canberra has also been the setting for other competitions, and we should be very grateful to those people that put the brief together for the National Parliament and for the way in which that competition was conducted, because it very largely restored faith in competitions in Australia, which although the Sydney Opera House was a great success, competitions as such got very bad airtime as a result of the reputed overrun in time and cost and all the rest of it. The competition for the National Museum was a competition which the Institute of Architects hear about. The RIBA withdrew its support from the Canberra competition in 1911. And very often we find ourselves in these awkward situations where the competition has a value but doesn't conform to all of the requirements. The reason it was the Canberra competition was held back by the RIBA was that they were concerned that the competition jury had not been named, the jury composition had not been decided, and there was a fear that government would interfere with the outcome of the design, the implementation of the design. None of that seems familiar to you at all, does it? Those of you who've been involved in competitions. So I thought what I would do is just run through a few images that recall some aspects of that competition and some issues that reflect on the current capathetical competition. The capathetical competition's objectives are kind of broad spread. I think that Robin Archer just hoped that something would come out, more than an acute focus on the making of a new thing. So competitors were asked generic questions such as what kinds of pressures and influences would there be if the city were being planned today? And are there relevant security concerns that would influence the location and design of a national capital today? There were initially. There was a fear of invasion. Can the design and location of a city influence clarity, compassion, and productivity in the thinking of governments and political representatives? We hope so. What influence would climate change have? And as a kind of Dorothy Dixer there. And can the design of a city influence the life and work of its residents? These were generic questions, generic issues that were opened. And then a series of criteria which reflect those those aspects of the key proposition. Moving backwards to move ahead, the vision initially, one of the people charged with contributing to the brief was the surveyor Charles Scrivener, and in 1909 he was given firm instructions to bear in mind that the federal capital should be a beautiful city, occupying a commanding position with extensive views and embracing distinctive features which would lend themselves to the evolution of a design worthy of the object, not only for the present, but for all time. And Scrivener, I pulled his name out because he did the work, or administered the work, of putting together this kind of wonderful survey of the landscape. And the survey itself went to the teams around the world, but it was also the basis of this model. It's a wax model of the landscape, which was sent, this model was sent to the capital of every state capital in Australia and to every capital of the key colonies of the Commonwealth of Great Britain at the time around the world, and to Washington. And it was a reference for those competitors that wished to better understand the landscape setting. But the making of the model pointed to the intimate understanding that was expected because of that competition of the competitors of the landscape. Also sent were these boxes, a metre long, or 3 foot, which contain the key plans, and the plans were not just the topography and the contour banding, but also the rainfall and the wind directions and so on, the geology, the underlying geology, trying to build up this, assuming that this was vital for the designers to have to hand. Also sent were this wonderful cyclorama, this wonderful image of the landscape painted by the architect Charles Coulter, and that was sent to all competitors as, again, a reference point, knowing that most people's understanding and experience of landscape would not match that of Canberra and its setting. I apologise for the grainy nature of the image, but this is just a detail taken from that cyclorama. And as you can imagine, in a pre-digital world, how valuable that kind of image would have been, and the signal it would have sent about a new city in its place. The jury eventually selected, after the competition was generated, comprised an architect, Fitzpatrick, a surveyor engineer, a civil engineer, and a mechanical engineer, and I'm doing them no disrespect by not recalling their names, and a further architect who was the secretary to the committee. The Minister for Home Affairs of the day, King O'Malley, was insistent that he would be responsible for the final decision, and that's what caused the nervousness of the RIBA. But here is the jury waiting for the drawings to be mounted on these racks in the ballroom of Government House down in Melbourne. 500 or so drawings arrived, 137 schemes were reviewed, of which 46 schemes were shortlisted. The plan, the key plan of each of those was photographed, and the photographed prints, about 2 foot square, were taken to site by the panel. This is the same jury, looking slightly more exhausted, on Camp Hill, where they set up a table and they reviewed every plan in its setting to form a view as to how appropriate or not the layout of the proposed city fitted the landscape. That reduced the number down to 11, and from the 11 there was a final 8. The 8 were divided there was no unanimity amongst the jury. It's difficult being a juror, and so there was a minority report from the chair of the jury and a majority report from the other 2 members of the jury, including Fitzpatrick. And King O'Malley, who's the guy in the front there, looking slightly confident about the world, he confirmed the decision of the minor jury, which saw Griffin's scheme come forward. Just moving a bit more quickly, those of you who've worked on competitions know how desperate it all is, and this is Steinberg's traditional view of an architect desperately working late at night with a companionship of dog. For Marion and Marnie Griffin, Marion very much was the driver. She egged Walter Burley Griffin on because he was failing to get going. As she pointed out to them, they only discovered the competition in the July. It was due in at the end of the year in 2011. And they really got going. She drew solidly from through November and December of that year. And there was a team of about 5 or 6 of them together working on the scheme. The drawings are world famous. They are extraordinary in themselves. And there is no question that they had a remarkable effect on the jury because, as Anthony said, of the closeness of their fit with the landscape, the understanding they showed of the possibilities, and the remarkable kind of colouring which evoked the colouring of the Australian landscape. And the city today, I mean, one of the curious things about the competition, it benefited from a wide number of entries from around the world. There's about 70 or so that were judged at the very end. 20 were shortlisted, and a summary of the jury's views of issues is, I mean, it's on the web, but a summary of the issues which they identified as themes arising from the entries was sustainability, a concern about whether a new city should be to the north of Australia, whether we should have a national city or rotating regionalism, a questioning of monumentality, a concern for ideas about virtual city, and for social inclusion, a questioning of the nature of governance in Australia, and a reinvention of Canberra itself. The exhibition, Anthony's a gentleman. He was more complimentary than I would be about the exhibition. I think the exhibition that you saw, I haven't seen it myself, but it would seem to be less than flattering to the quality of the entries. And several entries such as this, you really had to work hard to sort out what the entry was because you had to use the iPad and so on. And I think that the scroll approach taken by Brit and Mara, it very much evokes the intention of a competition, which is to reveal questions for you to solve. But on that point, I'll pass on and over to Mara.
And I'll ask you a question, I guess. So did you think in reading the competition conditions that they were actually discouraging to use Canberra as a place, as a site for?
I was surprised that they weren't more purposeful about Canberra itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that it kind of reflects the hesitancy that people have for their nation, that it's a great place to visit, not necessarily the best place to be. Hence Anthony coming to Brisbane. But I was surprised at the lack of forceful determination as to the future of that city.
Mm. Okay, interesting. Well, we chose to use Canberra for the site because it was quite important to us that the issue of memory and continuity of place, and we thought that was pretty much the most significant thing for a national capital. We thought the natural composition of Canberra's larger landscape and topography, mountains, hills and river and plain, are gathered in a way that define a distinct and memorable place that has a long history of habitation. And it's said the relationship of Mount Ainslie, seen to the left here, and Black Mountain to the right, is what the inhabitants of this area, the first inhabitants of this area, the Ngunnawal, referred to as Canberry, and that meant women's breasts. In our proposal, through the layered spatial and temporal process of sedimentary city, looking back to look forward and forward to look back, we worked to uncover the first city of Canberra. We used documented evidence by surveyors and explorers along with historical texts to map an impression of the landscape at this time as an underlay to compare to today and to use as a grounding from which to hypothesise about its future. And I'll speak now about what we learnt of this and the remnants of this first city landscape that actually still do exist in Canberra today. In mapping the first city and researching Canberra, we were lucky to meet with local historians in Canberra, such as Bill Gamage and Anne Gugler. And from Bill Gamage, we learnt about the landscape and its management. He describes the charred summit of Black Mountain, from which one could command a great view. And in particular, he describes the forest grasslands template, an open woodland forest on ridges with scattered trees, gum and apple box, with little or no undergrowth and kangaroo grass on the limestone plains. He describes the use of fire to manage the grasslands, and in his words, people burnt carefully to make this plain. It associated grass and water with shelter on an enclosing rise. He describes the changing seasons dry and wet, the Molonglo at times a chain of ponds, and the floodplain as a source of food and camps moving according to the season and availability of food. In mapping the first city, we were fortunate to find the work and eventually meet historian Anne Gugler, who with her guidance revealed to us first-hand aspects of the remnant first city landscape at Stirling Ridge and Park at Yarralumla, an area originally known by the Ngunnawal as Stony Ground. Her description of this landscape added another layer of understanding about the Ngunnawal, and also known as the Rock People, and the significance of the geology, landscape, watershed and vegetation to their wayfinding, pathways, meeting grounds and memorials. And without Anne's guidance, we otherwise would not have seen or fully understood the significance of this multi-layered landscape, highlighting why it's so vulnerable and still under threat of development, with recent proposals to build more embassies and with the current competition at the Prime Minister's Lodge at Tonga Point. And here's a little sound fragment of Anne discussing.
Is with one north and one south of the river? Is that why was it a dispute about something else?
No, Wurundjeri's, have a look at where their lands are.
Okay.
Prime land.
Yeah.
Good spot.
Yeah.
There are limestone caves along the river. There's limestone caves under Civic. I know people have been in them. Terry Horan's father took him in. He's dead now, but there are paintings there. So there's a lot of these things, but the movement goes through here, which is Burrabundarra, Stony Hills, obviously. This was above the lakes, which is why the limestone plains have very few trees. But it's always been relatively heavily timbered and protected. And they come up through the gap that area is very important, and I know down there, the NCA is trying to do it now. They're building on the other side over there where Howe is and all this stuff is. And the spots where there's nothing, including the block next to where the Chinese have destroyed 150 metres of stone arrangements, they say, well, we'll leave this as natural.
Anyway, that's Anne's description of the area, but now I'll try to explain some aspects of the landscape that Anne revealed to us, and the significant aspects of the pathways, ridge and watersheds and creeks as a way of orientating through the landscape, the significance of stones as a language of wayfinding and communication, and the significance of trees for utility and memory. What's happened here? Okay, sorry, a little. And this image shows the pathway in Stirling Ridge, and the main pathway that ran from the Gap to Black Mountain. And these stones that are along the ridge mark the Deakin fault line and the ley line, and they kind of an interesting remnant there. And then there's an ordered kind of stony ground that communicates and orientates and describes a larger landscape. And you have to kind of sift through the ground to find these. They're not immediately understood. And someone kind of has to reveal their arrangements to you. There are the stones that were used as tools and black stones that were brought to the site from elsewhere, and stone arrangements that made defined ant mounds and larger clearings, and stones that also mark significant trees. There were working trees for utility and some that kind of made bench tops kind of for working and making. Hollow trees and scar trees, and a grandmother tree from which knots were taken to carry water from the springs. And the largest tree is a cursing tree that relates to a nearby decursing tree that's marked by stones, and knots are removed and hollows are made, and in which stones are placed. And there's also burial trees around which rings of stones are placed and also are scarred. And at the edge of the ridge, the pathway that leads towards Black Mountain is a clearing, and in this clearing is defined by large established white gums, and several which are mourning trees, and that can kind of be seen amongst them. And these are identified by green weeping like cherry native wild cherries that are supported in a parasitic relationship with the white gum. And under these trees are stone arrangements in a depression in the ground. And then from the ridge, you move down through pathways that follow the watersheds with spring creeks. And the presence of water is defined by green patchy reed tufts against the brown leaves and stony ground. That can be kind of seen in these images. And you lead down to then the main pathway that moves from Tuggeranong to Red Hill and Black Mountain. And this path then gradually connects down and rises to a clearing to Artunga Point. And that was the old quarry. And from here, there is a view of Black Mountain and Ainslie, and which is a remnant view of the first city, with trees that currently obscure the high rises of Civic between. And this relationship of Stirling Park to Artunga Point as a remnant cultural landscape of continuity and memory still exists today in Canberra and is quite significant. And for this reason, it should be recognised and preserved as a valuable open space in the city. So that's just a small remnant landscape.
So in that sense, something like Stirling Park and Stirling Ridge and its cultural value to Aboriginal people, to the first city, was neither understood by Burley Griffin and his wife, nor was it put forward as a pre-existing landscape. But today, even to be part of this competition, there are now great hopes by historians and scientists who are working with the botanical aspect of the site to actually try and prevent the It's being included in the Prime Minister's Lodge second stage, or the idea that it should be a site. But how do you think it could be preserved?
Yeah, well, after talking to kind of these historians and environmentalists, they seem that the best way to preserve it is almost an annex to a botanical gardens, to kind of assure that the land is secured and not developed further, because it's currently very much open to threat.
And vulnerable.
Yes, yeah. So, and it is so significant and central in the city and not known about, yeah. So.
I'll just go back. We've been working with the idea of a sedimentary city as a process of analysing and critiquing the city for some time. And part of the position is that in response to changing conditions, cities periodically grow and shrink, and some fall into ruin, leaving only fragments, seemingly to vanish like many of the first cities of the past. Cities are therefore rarely built from scratch, but are over time overlaid, city layer upon city layer, so that within each new city layer there are remnants of all previous cities, if you look. Just quickly, so because Canberra and Brisbane, for example, don't have the layers in stone, I've just assembled, sorry about the blurred nature of it, but today Troy, so central in its location as a city, is now a heritage site and exists in a field, and yet over many, many years was an important city with growing populations and fantastic architecture. And it joins one of the many cities that have disappeared altogether, let alone being rebuilt and built on by other cities. Quickly, you can pick it up in the section. So this idea of archaeology or reverse archaeology, I mean, archaeologists have been working with this idea of mapping for a long time. Equally, because we have been working with publicly available information, we have also, in terms of looking at the past, we've also been interested in what the current thinking is among scientists and population demographers to understand their predictions for the future, both internationally and also for Canberra. A very influential person, but only one of many. I mean, Kevin O'Brien and Louise Noble locally have also worked with layering, and now it's become much more widespread. But one of the very early proponents of the thinking of sedimentary city and building the city on the city was Antoine Bloomberg. And you can see here, if you want to check it up, you can look at the Rome-Interrotta project that was done using the Nolly plan and making propositions from that, but also other work that he did in his teaching in urbanism in Paris in the 70s. Now, we also, Mara's explained a little bit about the development of the first city plan. So we also worked from archives, like the New South Wales Archives holds the original plan that we worked from with the Dixon plan and the Hoddle field books. So we could go into and understand the early documentation of as close as possible to try and get something of the topography and something of an understanding of what was being valued by the surveyors at the time. So the process of sedimentary city, you'll recognise the first city from Mara's explanation, but the process of sedimentary city not only offers a basis for analysis and critique of the city, but also invites an envisioning of alternative futures. And in so doing looks to find a balance and order and continuity between the nature of the first city and the built environment of contemporary city, and to reinterpret this towards clarifying a vision for the survival of a future city. In this process of capithetical Canberra, the project and process of looking back has involved a study of the 1829 first city, Griffin's city layers, reaffirming the long history of inhabitation, and looking forward has included reviewing contemporary Canberra and the now city layer and testing the implications of forecast worst-case environmental, economic, social catastrophes for the city layers of business-as-usual flood city, followed by business-as-usual inferno city. Even the first city is an approximation because we know that there have been many thousands of years of occupations of the land. So please be aware that the first city is almost an analogy for the beginning. So the first city, as Mara's pointed out, is based on this map, and we've accentuated aspects. The systematically produced forest template she's talked about, and the way of altering the landscape for sustenance. But the locus of the first city and its landforms are very easily grasped by the memory and hold in memory the images deposited on them. The mountains and hills with their distinct potency and wayfinding foster identity in the first city and have become memorials through the process of marking, representing and naming. The Ngunnawal elder, Mr. Don Bell, said that Canberry or Canberry refers to the two mountains, Black and Ainslie, which viewed from the north, it means woman's breasts. On each mountain and others there would be pyramids of stones that direct the eye from one mountain to the other. One river rock used in the arrangements around the mourning tree is thought to be from Black Mountain. There's a little quote that we found from a journal by 1820 by Charles Throsby Smith and Joseph Weil, who wrote, "At 10 o'clock we ascended a very high hill, we presume it to be Black Mountain, from the top of which we had an extensive view all around. The banks of the river on both sides and the whole of the way we went was a distance near 10 miles. It is a most beautiful forest as far as we could see, thinly wooded by gums and bastard box, the tops of the hills stony and stony sand. But in the valleys of fine rich soil, the banks of this river is flooded about 30 feet perpendicular, and at noon, hot and sultry, we saw several natives' fires at a distance, the first I have seen since we left the new country, by which they meant New South Wales." So moving on to Griffin City, you've seen here, we found some amazing aerial photographs taken just after the war, where you can see the beginnings of putting the Griffin plan on the landscape. And there are many cities between the first city and the Griffin city. There's the settler city, for example, because soon after that 1829 plan, there were sheep and graziers moving in to settle the land. And the Aboriginal first city was pushed to one side. So here we've overlaid Griffin City is represented by Griffin's 1912 City and Environs Competition Plan, which is laid over Dixon's 1828 map, and Hoddle's 1832 survey map of limestone plains, and Scrivener's 1909 survey of Canberra. So there's 3 layers there. Scrivener's survey has been colour graded above the 1900 foot contour to illustrate the relative heights of the significant hills and mountains, demonstrating relations between the elevated landforms and Griffin's ideal city. Griffin's plan reveals how the new city, planned for 25,000 people, was laid out across the first city's estates of managed and fertile land. Gamage writes that it is as if Griffin City was squeezed in between the 2 prime sites, not only of the Moores and the Campbells settled stations at the foot of Black Mountain and Ainslie, but the place of both the Canberra and Pialigo camps of the first city. Significant continuities because we use a process of valuing, which I'll come back to when we hit Italo Calvino's imagined conversation. The significant continuities are those things that capture the imagination and have value forward into the next city. So the significant continuities for capathetical Canberra include a population of 25,000, Griffin's land axis and view lines marking significant hills and mountains, the commemoration at Mount Ainslie and the parliamentary group at Kurrajong Hill and Camp Hill on the terraces. I included this aerial photograph because of the poignancy of seeing one part of the Griffin plan emerging almost like a sort of a lichen on a rock. Just the business of putting an ideal plan into practice. And also, Peter Nelson and Mara, we're trying to find a view that matches a photograph that's taken so we can understand in the now city where you would see those aspects of the Griffin and the first city plans. So now city is represented by a 2011 aerial photograph of Canberra that reveals the urban sprawl made possible by availability of both affordable land, personal transport, which fragments and disperses the population and contributes to a loss of productive farming land. Disproportionate increases in population from the 25,000 in Griffin's City to 367,000 in Now City have also contributed to calls for greater building heights and increased densities, disorienting pedestrians and diminishing the city's place identity from within the new city centre. Significant continuities from capathetical Canberra include the Parliamentary Triangle buildings and gardens, Australian War Memorial, Anzac Parade, and effective infrastructure. We then found data and various sources about flooding, dam burst, and earthquake, and most of this we found was available in Canberra itself. There was also some information that we found in the New Scientist. But this is just a snapshot of some of the information. So, business as usual flood city, the population's risen to 550,000 by, progressively keep building it closer to flood-prone areas. The 21st century's predicted extreme weather events increase and dormant fault lines reactivate, terrible unpredictable catastrophes, a combined result of earthquake, dam burst and intense storms, devastate business as usual flood city, causing water shortages, subsequent evacuations and population numbers fall. We also found images from the 2003 firestorm that went through and cut into places like Duffy, but also the fire load information which is held in Canberra and the plans to deal with these predicted firestorms into this century and beyond. The 21st century's higher temperatures, heat waves, longer drought periods, water, food and energy rationing, dust storms and megafires continues to ravage Inferno City, and sections of the evacuated populations do not return after the pandemic. We then find Recovery City. After repeated fires, earthquake, disease and flood and devastation, which is severe, the stain of the fires and flood leave a vivid record across the earth. Recovery City's national leadership heeds the forces of the land and lessons from science and the past and seizes the opportunity to incrementally reconstruct the nation's capital. Ruins are dismantled and stored for reuse. Key roads and infrastructure are repaired. Grass, land fire breaks and riverbeds are restored. Land for food production is progressively cleared. Creeks, fire breaks and and wetlands are restored and re-engineered. Significant remnants are retained, and Parliament House, memorials and cultural institutions of the nation are secured and conserved. It's a long period. So, in making the new, in recovering, there is a searching the past and looking into the future. And here are some images of works by, and all of them to try and find ways to make buildings in the city of the type that can adjust to the land, somehow adjust to the landscape. So I'm not going to go through the whole of this, but the hypothetical scenario. By mid to late 21st century, most cities in Australia are experiencing falling population numbers. This is the hypothetical. Increasingly severe weather events, including drought, fire, earthquake, flood, and sea inundation, whilst simultaneously enduring food, water, and energy rationing and the after effects of a pandemic. The capital city of Australia, Canberra, through inspired national leadership, has led the way forward in first adapting successfully to change and inspiring the reshaping of all cities to better defend and nurture their citizens. And then we go through just Canberra, why we chose Canberra. Canberra because of its place memory. Canberra's hypothetical city continues to be acclaimed as the nation's capital by exhibiting ever more powerfully distinct and memorable expressions of continuity and unity. Surrounding ancient mountains and hills hold in place a city that in turn holds and represents the collective narrative of the national memorials. Here is a unity of past and present land and peoples. Canberra's very name from the Ngunnawal language calls up and situates the continuity of the people's meeting place between the breast and at the head of Mother Earth across the limestone plains. So it's a late 21st century city layer of Canberra and overlays all pre-existing layers that were constructed over the terrain of the first city of Ngunnawal, Nanbra country. The new city reintroduces from the past city layers those qualities that continue to engage the imagination, particularly those holding the memories of the nation in place. It retains fragments from past city layers that support national capital values of unity and continuity, and other past practices and elements are recovered and reinvented for the new micro-city as it adapts to radically changing conditions. And the city exists as an outer city and an inner city. The outer city, won't go into it too much, the fire-prone lands have been transformed and is a place of bold experimentation, of instant city, of camping, and ways of, and definitely part of the food production. And the inner city, the population numbers having stabilised at 8 million, you'll be pleased to know, hypothetical Canberra supports 75,000 people in the densely concentrated and international inner city, and the outer city's farmlands and open landscapes. The form of the high-tech micro-city constructed around Kurrajong Hill and encircling Parliament House acknowledges Griffin's land axis and the new axis linking Capitol Hill and Black Mountain, and shifts the focus to the centre by framing the open plain between Mount Ainslie and Black Mountain. The inner city, and sited outside the floodplain, is defended from fire and wind to the west and to the south by undulating habitable wall buildings ranging in height from 2 to 7 stories and opening towards the north for views of the fields, river and winter sunlight. The city's multifunctional urban fabric integrates residential, commercial, industrial, university, military, embassies and others within the 3-kilometre range and is serviced by renewable energy, compact waste recycling and standby water harvesting with condensation windmills. The inner city of 400 hectares is a density of about 64 persons per hectare and houses approximately 25,000 in building forms that support unity and continuity with the topography. The walkable inner city has access to outlying areas and surrounding farmlands with light rail servicing, and to the Oz Super Express, which operates for the Mobile Parliament Australia-wide. Among the inner city's significant elements recovered from past city layers are the first city's pathways to Tuggeranong and meeting places at Kurrajong Hill, Griffin's city land access and parliamentary triangle, and the city's exotic trees, Parliament House, War Memorial and Anzac Parade, and from Flood City, the Inferno City and Recovery City, recycled salvage materials incorporated in iTech construction. Sorry, it was so long.
Brit, I wondered if I could ask you a question specific to camping. And the term camp has come up with a few of the speakers. The original settlement of camps by the first Australians, Camp Hill in Canberra, and in your scheme you have an idea about camping as a way, I think, of occupying some of the spaces that are regularly flooded or affected by fire, and I wondered if you could speak to that.
Well, just briefly, and you're a footballer, Anthony?
Yes.
I don't know which teams play, but I can imagine there'd be football matches and occasions such as the Anzac Day, where lots of people go to Canberra, and one of the opportunities we saw was an instant, high-tech fold-out camping opportunities, as well as the low-tech camping that we saw in the first city, but also in those construction camps that were built in the 50s, where people who worked on the building of the Griffin's Canberra lived for many, many years. Don't know if that helps, but
it does help. Thank you. I might steal the control. Thank you. So, flick through. So I might start with a quote about camping that perhaps picks up on this idea of the temporary and the more permanent occupation of space. This is from Charlie Haley, who's written a guidebook to camping, and I'll just read it. Camps also afford shifts from permanence to temporality. This renewed transience might be in response to economic turns or the effects of natural disaster, which I think Sedimentary City speaks to. And in other cases, the camp is a recreational space of play outside of societal norms. So thinking of the last as an example of camp, as a way that one might occupy Sedimentary City and those areas set aside for temporary occupation, I think of Burning Man, which is the festival of gathering of people that happens in Black Rock in Nevada. In this case, it's in some mud flats. Some of the audience might have been to Burning Man. So for a week, 48,000 people come and form a temporary city through camping. And by necessity, they have developed some planning and guidance as to how one occupies this space. And on the image on the top right, you can see a skydiver jumping over the temporary city that's formed there, now known as Black Rock City. Originally, it started in San Francisco, and by need and popularity spread to kind of the desert and the mud flats. So I thought that might be a way of imagining what Sedimentary City might offer us in terms of planning for events and spaces in those landscapes, particularly those landscapes that you can't occupy on a permanent basis because we know that they'll flood. A question quite relevant to us in Brisbane and many cities in Australia, of course. So now there are some images of some of the other schemes just to provide some context, and this is a scheme that I think is quite sensitive. It's also working with Canberra as a site because many of the capithetical schemes actually chose to perhaps relocate or set up a new capital city, and this one was working with inserting things within the existing city. This was the scheme by the University of Sydney students Kate Dickinson and Annabelle Cox. So they were master's students and they won the student prize for the competition. So there were a number of shortlisted student prizes. But this one is again about inserting elements such as urban agriculture, sustainable technologies. We can see images of turbines, wind turbines and so forth being inserted selectively within the existing city of Canberra. And what was interesting about their scheme, and I thought similar to Mara and Brit's scheme, was that they were trying to not think of the capital as a giant symbol of the centre so much, but they were looking at processes and human scales and the ways of making a city in the way that we might think of campers as makers as well. So there was kind of a democracy behind their scheme. Okay, so this was two different schemes, and they were dealing with the temporary occupation of space, but in this case it was, instead of having a fixed urban centre like Canberra, it was taking on board the idea that we could get the parliament and move them to different locations. So the top scheme is from the University of Tasmania, Helen Norrie and team, ex-UQ person, and they decided that with new technologies we didn't necessarily need a physical fixed urban centre, and that would allow the opportunity to again take the city or the parliament, if it's a place of gathering, to different places across Australia, including Tasmania. So this is an idea of a regional capital, kind of a political idea, I suppose, about sharing and spreading the idea of the parliament being symbolic of the centre. And the one below is also an idea about the roving capital. In this case, it would go to different cities for 15 years and then be relocated. And this was the first prize, the winning scheme, and it was by Ecoscape Australia. And they speak about the northern capital. So this scheme, and there's another scheme I'll show you, that actually talks to Darwin as being the new sort of epicentre of Australia, particularly because it can act as the geographic gateway to Asia. So in Ecoscape's view, they had an idea that you keep Parliament in Canberra, but you establish a whole new city up in Darwin, which I think was centred around an existing lake, if I understand the scheme properly. And in the images here, you can see they're talking to issues of sustainability, post-colonialism and so forth, particularly because it seemed to be a physical gateway to the rest of the world nearby. So there isn't much detail as to how this might work, but they do talk about having the administrative centre for the Australian Defence Force being located there, and a large education centre, so feeding into Asia, which again I thought was quite political considering the government's views on education and investing in money in that sector, but I won't talk about that now. So going back to this idea of being productive in the making of cities and sustainability, this is an image which talks to the idea that what they call the new northern capital could be a funnel for feeding food to Asia and the rest of the world. I'm not sure that if their scheme talks specifically to growing food in Darwin, although this image suggests that that might happen, but I think it's more of a gateway project. And this was a scheme in which, from the University of Western Australia, so from Richard Weller, from the Research Institute Aldrich, and it was the highly commended scheme after Brit and Mara's scheme. And it really arose from focusing on analysing population growth and the way in which cities are already growing in Australia. And so you can see there they're trying to highlight areas of growth and regions of growth, suggesting that cities will start to merge and become concentrated zones of population. But again, they also talked to the issue of Darwin being an important key point in Australia for the same reasons as Ecoscape spoke to. And so I'll just show you a few different images, because I was really, my imagination was sparked by this idea of the way that we might occupy spaces in a temporary way, and what those spaces might be and how we as architects might contribute to the making of space, particularly those spaces that are affected by flood, and that really you can't dwell there in a house, that you have to think of another way of using space. So these are some images of the Parks Cycle project by Rebar. Rebar are an art and design collaborative based in San Francisco, another region affected potentially by environmental issues. And here, most of you would be familiar with the Parking Day project, which they initiated, which is occupying car spaces in the city to raise questions about how much space is dedicated to the car instead of to parks and agriculture, and also particularly the public use of space. So this particular project they made to fit the size of a standard car space, and it's bicycle powered and it's a mobile park, and you can hop in it and ride away whenever needed. So I imagined in a flood-prone area you could bring your park with you. In the image on the left, I think they were taking it to the car park of the Mayor of San Francisco to generate a conversation about public space and the city. I've included that. That's an image for the first years, so the first year architecture students. But they recently did an installation in Burnett Lane, which the street was closed for that event. But the images there are because it was part of the Brisbane City Council thinking about the temporary use of space in the city and ways that we might occupy the space and get people into the city. In this case, it's not related to environmental issues, but it's related to just engaging with the city in a temporary way and bringing people in. So it's an example of the council being behind this idea of the temporary occupation of space, and certainly the sedimentary city requires a view and support by the council, particularly in terms of how you might mobilise people in the event of a disaster, and raises questions about how architects can engage with that. And the last image is of, or a couple of images by Paolo Soleri, the recently deceased Italian-American architect, who developed, as you see in the top images, Arcosanti, which is the experimental community in the middle of a desert. So I thought, it's a very fragile and difficult space to occupy, but although it's quite remote, he has a vision that we should all occupy space in a more dense mode. You could say he was sustainable, since he started imagining us living in cities and in dense populations that stop urban sprawl. So Arcosanti was his way of trying to build one of these. But the images below are of his recent visions of how we might occupy the earth, where you constrain occupation to this long linear form that snakes across landscapes, and therefore, because everyone's living densely and living in a multi-use way, there's less reliance on cars, it's more compact and allows more space for agriculture. But the image is there specifically because in Brit and Mara's scheme there was an idea about the occupied defensible wall that kind of defined and constrained population growth as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Okay.
Kathy, I have a question for you.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, and I'm interested in the temporary and this fleeting occupation, and thinking, why is that idea so powerful now? What about it? What about the world compels us to think about the temporary as, is it an escape? Is it, what is it about?
Why are we obsessed by the temporary? Well, I think there's the sort of fundamental survival need to think about the temporary occupation of space in response to environmental disasters that will clearly affect all of us in some way in cities across the world. So there's a need to think about camps and camping and mobile infrastructures that can pack down. But in a more optimistic view, there seems to be an embrace of the idea of people gathering together and occupying and celebrating space. So to me, that's an optimistic view, how you can still occupy difficult spaces and flood-prone areas.
Thanks, Kathy. I've never thought of Christian as being intimidating, but he's certainly giving me a very fierce look there, saying, wind it up, Nick. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, we won't have time for questions, unfortunately, but if you want to close my...
Yeah, I'll do it as well as I can. I don't intend to recap that, but I really, I think all of my colleagues here, but Kathy bringing things, using Arcosanti as the kind of reference point, because so often we look at utopian conditions I think one of the lessons from Sedimentary City is to look at the data that is there and not to avoid the issues that we know about that are coming or that we've faced up to, whether they're to do with economy, political structure, or our physical location in the world, or some of the hazards that we're experiencing, some of the dreadful accident that occurred in America today, and some of that storm that went through, and all that. It's almost as if we've got a habit of looking somewhere else in the hope that that's better, rather than focusing on what we know and what we need to know in order to improve our understanding of what is possible. The other thing that I hope will be taken away from the discussion is that just about all of us in one way are involved in guiding others in the shaping of the place that they live in, whether it's at small scale or large scale and so on. And inevitably the gaze goes to that particular issue or problem. And yet there's an enormous benefit kind of removing the blinkers and thinking more broadly, more generally, and more generously about what the places could be if we just shifted the parameters, or if we were more optimistic or more persistent about delivery. I think it's appropriate that I hope you would join me in congratulating Brit and Mara on their award. Fantastic. And I would be grateful if you would join me in thanking my colleagues here for the work they've put in preparing for this evening. Thank you. It's been an honour to be part of this series, and I think that your eye is firmly on next week's event, assuming that there is one. Yes, there is. David Leatherborough, who should not be missed. Okay, thank you. Good night.